November 1945. 650 miles east of Hawaii, a flying boat sits on the open Pacific with two dead engines. Everyone aboard is rescued. The aircraft won't sink. So a U.S. Navy tender opens fire, and it takes roughly 1,300 rounds of 20mm cannon to put the Honolulu Clipper under. 6 years earlier, that same hull carried a 14-seat dining room, white tablecloths, and passengers paying more for a round trip than the price of a new car. 12 were built. Today, not one Boeing 314 exists anywhere on Earth. The strange part isn't that it died, it's why. Because this is not the usual story. The Boeing 314 was not a prototype that never flew properly, and it was not killed by a fatal flaw or a regulator's report. It crossed oceans on a published timetable. It carried Winston Churchill. It carried a sitting American president. It flew around the world in the middle of a war, westward, improvising fuel stops on continents it had never been cleared to operate over. By every test anyone applied to it, the thing worked. And within 7 years of its first commercial flight, the airline that ordered it had sold off every last one, and the type was on its way to the scrapyard and the seabed. So what exactly failed here? Keep that question open, because the obvious answers are all going to let you down. First, look at it. If you saw a Boeing 314 on the water, you would probably assume you were looking at two aircraft welded together. The proportions are wrong in a way that's hard to ignore. The hull is deep and slab-sided, more ship than airplane, over 100 feet of it, with a stepped bottom like a speedboat and a two-deck interior. Bolted on top of that is a wing of 152 feet, which was enormous for 1938 and looks borrowed. It was borrowed. And low on each side of the hull, just above the waterline, sit two fat streamlined blisters that no land plane has ever needed. Those blisters are the first clue that somebody had thought hard about this. A flying boat has a stability problem the moment it stops flying. Sitting on water, it wants to roll, and if a wingtip dips into a swell, you can lose the aircraft on the surface. The usual fix was a small float hung under each wingtip on struts, which works, and which also means dragging two useless objects through the air for thousands of miles. Boeing used sponsons instead, a solution taken from European practice, particularly Dornier's. They hold the aircraft level, they add buoyancy, they double as a walkway for passengers, boarding from a launch, and inside them, you can put fuel. One piece of structure doing 4 jobs. The wing was a different kind of decision, and a smarter one commercially. Boeing had spent serious money building an experimental bomber for the Army, the XB-15, which was a disappointment as a bomber because engines of the mid-1930s could not push something that large fast enough to be useful. But it had a very large, very efficient wing, and a tailplane to match, both already designed, already tested, already paid for. When Pan American Airways asked American industry in 1935 for a flying boat that could cross oceans with a commercial payload, Boeing's engineer Wellwood Beale took the XB-15's wing, attached it to a new hull built for passengers, and offered that. It meant the 314 arrived with a proven flying surface rather than a hopeful one. Now the part that matters more than any of the hardware, why anyone wanted a boat in the first place. In the 1930s, if you wanted to fly across an ocean, you were not choosing between a flying boat and a land plane. You were choosing between a flying boat and a ship. Long, hard-surfaced runways barely existed. Building one took months, money, engineering plant, and a government that wanted it there. Meanwhile, the planet was already equipped with the largest network of ready-made landing sites imaginable, maintained free of charge at Horta and Lisbon and Botwood and Wake and Honolulu. Water. A protected harbor or a wide river needed almost nothing added to it. A mooring, a launch, a fuel barge, a shed. If your aircraft could land on water, you could open a route across an empty ocean in weeks, instead of years. There was a second argument, more persuasive to anyone who had to sell tickets. A big hull that has to float is a big hull anyway. You have already accepted the weight and the volume, so you may as well fill it. That is why the 314 could be laid out like a small liner rather than like a bus. 2 decks, a galley with 2 stoves, separate dressing rooms for men and women, a rear compartment sold as a private suite, sleeping berths for around 40 on overnight legs, and by day up to 74 seats, though nobody on a long ocean crossing ever saw it configured that way. And in the middle of the main deck, a dining salon that seated 14 at a time, with tablecloths, china, and stewards serving in 2 sittings. Say that out loud, and it sounds like decoration. It wasn't. It was the product. Pan American was not competing against another airline on the North Atlantic in 1939. There wasn't one. It was competing against the Cunard and the French line, against 5 days at sea in a first-class cabin with a barber and a swimming pool. To take a passenger off a liner and put them in an aircraft, you had to beat the ship on time, which was easy, and not humiliate it on comfort, which was not. The dining room was the answer to a business problem, and the business problem was the ocean liner. Behind all of it stood Juan Trippe, who ran Pan American and who had already done the hard part once. Pan Am had crossed the Pacific in 1935 with the Martin M130, building the fuel and accommodation chain at Midway and Wake as it went. Trippe had proved an ocean airline could be run on a schedule. What he needed next was an aircraft with the range and payload to make it pay. Pan Am ordered 6 Boeing 314 aircraft in July 1936. The price is usually given as around $550,000 per aircraft, which made it the most expensive commercial aircraft order anyone had placed. A DC-3 in the same period cost roughly a fifth of that. This was not an airline dabbling. Pan Am was putting an extraordinary share of its future into 12 hulls. And on paper, the aircraft justified it. 4 Wright double cyclone engines, 1,500 horsepower each, hauling a loaded weight of over 80,000 pounds off the water. Cruise around 180 miles an hour, which no ship could argue with. Range in the neighborhood of 3,500 miles, which was the number that mattered, because 3,500 miles turns the North Atlantic from an impossible jump into a manageable series of legs. Engineers could reach the engines from inside the wing during flight, through crawlways, which meant a failure at hour 9 over open water was not automatically the end of the story. If those numbers are accurate, and they were, this aircraft should have owned the oceans for 20 years. It very nearly didn't get off the water at all. The first 314 flew on June 7, 1938, from Puget Sound, with Boeing's test pilot Eddie Allen in command. Allen was as good as anyone in the world at this, and what he found was that the aircraft did not want to hold a heading. It was directionally unstable. In plain terms, the vertical tail was not big enough to keep a 100-foot hull pointing where the pilot wanted it, especially with that huge wing above it. On an airliner expected to fly 14 hours through Atlantic weather with a steward pouring wine on the deck below, you cannot. So Boeing rebuilt the tail. Not once. The single fin was removed and replaced with 2 fins mounted out on the tailplane, which improved matters and still wasn't enough. Then the center fin went back on between them. That is how the 314 ended up with the 3-tail arrangement it's remembered for. It was not styling, it was the visible scar of a problem that took several attempts to solve, and it is the last time in this story that anything genuinely wrong with the aircraft gets fixed. From here on, every problem the 314 meets is somewhere else. The fix worked. Boeing delivered Honolulu Clipper in early 1939, and by late February she was flying San Francisco to Hong Kong. On May 20th, 1939, Yankee Clipper carried the first scheduled transatlantic airmail from New York, out by way of the Azores and Lisbon to Marseille. On June 28th, Dixie Clipper left Port Washington with 22 paying passengers and took them to Marseille. Scheduled commercial passenger service across the Atlantic Ocean, by air, on a timetable. Nobody had ever done it. The passenger accounts are consistent. This was the most comfortable way anyone had ever flown. Not the fastest, and not the highest. The 314 was unpressurized, so it flew in the weather rather than above it, generally between 8 and 12,000 feet, and passengers felt the Atlantic. But you could get up and walk. You could sit down to a hot dinner with a view of the ocean. You could go to bed in a berth with curtains and wake up on another continent. In 1939, that combination did not exist anywhere else in aviation, and it would not exist again for decades. So, an aircraft that worked, doing something nobody else could do, in a market with no competitor. Here is the number that should worry you. A one-way ticket, New York to Southampton, cost around $375. The round trip was about $675. In 1939, average annual earnings in the United States were somewhere near $1,300, and a new car could be had for less than that round-trip fare, which is not, in itself, a problem. Luxury travel is supposed to be expensive. The problem is what was happening at the other end of the arithmetic. That cabin was designed to hold up to 74 people. To cross the Atlantic against the wind, the 314 was filling those sponsons and wing tanks with fuel, and fuel weighs the same as passengers. The aircraft that left New York was not carrying 74 fares. It was carrying somewhere in the mid-30s at best, sleeping in berths that each took the space of 2 seats. waited on by a crew of 10 or 11, eating food that had to be loaded aboard hot. The dining room was the reason people chose the Clipper. It was also floor space that had never sold a single ticket of its own, on an aircraft whose paying capacity had just been cut in half by the very distance that made it special. For 11 weeks in the summer of 1939, none of that mattered, because the bookings were full and the world was watching. Then, on the 1st of September, Germany invaded Poland. The war did not kill the Clipper. That is the first thing to get straight, because it's the explanation most people reach for, and it is wrong in an interesting way. What the war killed was the route. The Atlantic crossing Pan Am had opened ran north, by way of Shediac and Botwood and Foynes on the Shannon estuary, then on to Southampton. Britain went to war on the 3rd of September, and the northern terminus became impossible for a neutral American airline. So Pan Am moved south. Horta in the Azores. Lisbon. Portugal was neutral, which made the Tagus River the one place in Europe where an American flying boat could tie up without anyone's air force taking an interest. And business did not collapse. It got stranger and better. Lisbon in 1940 was the drain through which a continent emptied. Refugees with visas and without them. Diplomats, couriers, intelligence officers of every nationality, businessmen whose business had become very complicated. The Clipper was the only scheduled way in or out of Europe by air, and every seat on it was worth whatever Pan Am asked. Priority mail, sealed diplomatic pouches, people whose governments needed them across an ocean within days rather than weeks. For an airline that had been nervously watching its cost per passenger mile in 1939, this was deliverance. Nobody was comparing the fare to a Cunard cabin anymore, because the Cunard cabin was being fitted out as a troop ship. Pan Am doubled down. It ordered 6 more aircraft, the improved 314A, with 1,600 horsepower engines, more fuel, and a bit more payload. 12 Boeing 314 aircraft in total, which remains the entire production run of the type. And here the war handed the aircraft its first genuine second chance, from a direction nobody had planned for. Britain needed to talk to America, constantly, urgently, and in person. What Britain did not have was a long-range aircraft that could put a cabinet minister in Washington and bring him home. So in 1941, 3 of the new 314A aircraft went to the British Overseas Airways Corporation instead of to Pan Am. Bristol, Berwick, and Bangor. Reported prices vary, but every version is startling. Around $1 million an aircraft, roughly double what Pan Am had paid 5 years earlier. Boeing's flying boat had become a strategic asset, and its resale value had gone up rather than down. Then it got better still. In January 1942, Winston Churchill was in Bermuda, having crossed to Washington by battleship, and the return voyage looked slow. Berwick was there. Churchill decided to fly, and by his own account he spent time on the flight deck and took the controls for a while. 20 hours or so out of Bermuda, they came into Plymouth. Britain's Prime Minister had crossed the Atlantic in a commercial airliner in wartime, and he liked it enough to do it again. A year later, on January 11th, 1943, Dixie Clipper left Miami with Franklin Roosevelt aboard, bound by way of Trinidad and Belém for Bathurst in the Gambia, from where he continued to the Casablanca Conference. No sitting American president had ever flown anywhere. The first one did it in a Boeing 314 and celebrated his 61st birthday aboard the same aircraft on the way home, with the crew serving dinner in the dining salon. And somewhere between those 2 flights, the aircraft did something so improbable that it still sounds invented. On December 7, 1941, Pacific Clipper was on a routine leg toward Auckland when the news came through about Pearl Harbor. Captain Robert Ford had an unarmed civilian flying boat on the wrong side of a Pacific that had just become a battlefield, and orders to get the aircraft home to New York by any route available. He went west, Australia, then across the Indian Ocean, then Ceylon, Karachi, Bahrain, Khartoum, Leopoldville, across the South Atlantic to Nedal in Brazil, up to Trinidad, and into the marine terminal at LaGuardia on January 6, 1942. Roughly 31,000 miles over territory Pan Am had never surveyed, refueling on automobile gasoline where nothing else existed, navigating stretches of it by dead reckoning and star sights, with no spares and no support. The aircraft made it. Of course it did. The whole reason a flying boat existed was that it did not need anything on the ground to be waiting for it. If you are keeping score on technical merit and operational usefulness, the Boeing 314 has just won both categories outright, which is exactly the problem, and it takes a while to see why. Look again at who was buying. Britain bought 3, because Britain needed a specific capability during an emergency and had no time to develop one. The US Army took some 314s on as C-98 aircraft, the Navy took others, and in practice, most of them kept flying with Pan Am crews under military contract, hauling priority passengers and cargo on routes the government designated. Utilization was high, revenue was guaranteed, and the aircraft was busier than it had ever been. None of those customers were buying aircraft the way an airline buys aircraft. A wartime government charters what exists. It does not place a follow-on order for 40 more of a hand-built flying boat, because it is spending its industrial capacity on bombers and transports it can produce by the thousand. Every one of the 314's great wartime successes proved that the aircraft was useful to people who were never going to buy another one. That sounds like a technicality. It is the whole story in miniature, and Boeing understood it perfectly. After the 12th aircraft, Boeing built no more flying boats. Ever. The company that had just produced the most capable ocean airliner in the world put its factories onto the B-17 and then the B-29. Meanwhile, the operating reality of a flying boat was becoming visible in a way the promotional material had avoided. Landing on water sounds free. Water is everywhere, flat, and costs nothing. Except that water you can land a 100,000-pound aircraft on is not just any water. You need it sheltered, because open ocean swell will destroy a hull. You need it deep and long and clear of shipping and debris. You need a mooring buoy strong enough to hold the aircraft in a blow, launches to bring passengers out, a fuel barge, and men who can handle a large aircraft on a moving surface. You need beaching gear to get it out of the water for maintenance, because salt water attacks aluminium continuously. And a harbor with the wrong sea state is simply closed, so the aircraft waits or diverts hundreds of miles. The flying itself was not risk-free either, because the moment of contact with water is not forgiving. On the evening of February 22nd, 1943, Yankee Clipper came into the Tagus at Lisbon on a night landing. She was maneuvering at low altitude when a wing went down and caught the water. The aircraft broke up. Of the 39 people aboard, 24 died. Among them, the journalist Ben Robertson and the singer Tamara Drayson. The entertainer Jane Froman was among the survivors and was seriously injured. She spent years in surgery afterwards. The investigation's findings pointed at the handling of the approach rather than at any structural or mechanical failure of the aircraft. A low, banked turn close to a dark surface where the pilot's judgment of height had very little to work with. Accounts of exactly what was intended in those final seconds differ, and the surviving record does not settle all of it. But nothing in it says the Boeing 314 was a bad airplane. That distinction, though, is the kind of thing that matters to engineers and to almost nobody else. What the crash demonstrated to everybody watching was that this method of arriving at a destination had a particular way of going wrong. On a black river, with no lights, no markings, and no runway to tell you where the ground was. Land aerodromes were getting approach lighting, radio aids, marked thresholds, and instrument procedures. A harbor got a launch with a lamp. The Clipper had just taken the deadliest kind of hit, an accident that said nothing damning about the airframe and everything unflattering about the concept. Even then, the 314 kept working. The surviving aircraft flew through the war, crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific and running the African routes to Leopoldville, and their dispatch reliability was the sort of thing airlines brag about. If you had asked anyone in 1944 whether Boeing's flying boat had proved itself, the answer would have been obvious. So here is where you would reasonably expect the story to go. The war ends, the world wants to travel again. Pan Am owns the most luxurious long-range airliner ever built, the routes to fly it on, the ocean bases to support it, and a public that remembers the Clipper as the most glamorous thing in the sky. Order the next generation, bigger and faster, and keep the dining room. Pan Am withdrew the Boeing 314 from service in 1946. Not gradually. The whole type gone, sold off cheap, to small operators within a year of the peace it had survived. The competing explanations at this point all look plausible and all fall apart under pressure. The crash? 24 deaths was terrible, and it did not ground the fleet or stop the rout. Age? The 314As were 4 years old. Operating cost? Real. And Pan Am had been living with it profitably since 1939. Something wrong with the aircraft? Nobody has ever produced it. Something had happened during the war that had nothing to do with the Boeing 314's performance, its safety record, its economics, or its passengers. It happened on the ground, in places the Clipper never landed. Concrete, crushed rock, tar, and steel matting, laid down by military engineers in a hurry, on every continent that had a war on it. Between 1939 and 1945, the world built airfields at a rate nobody had imagined possible. The Americans alone constructed or improved thousands of them, and the ones that mattered here were the strategic staging fields, because they were built precisely where crossing an ocean requires a stop. Gander in Newfoundland, Goose Bay, Keflavik, Prestwick. The Azores, where the Allies obtained facilities in 1943 and paved runways on Terceira. Ascension Island in the middle of the South Atlantic, where engineers cut a runway out of volcanic rock in a matter of months. Across the Pacific, the same thing, island by island, because taking an island and flattening part of it was the standard method of the campaign. None of this was built for airlines. It was built to ferry bombers and move troops, paid for out of budgets no commercial operator could have raised in a century. But when the shooting stopped, it was still there, drained, lit, surveyed, and connected by radio ranges and weather reporting, sitting exactly where an ocean route needs a link. Now go back to the argument that justified the flying boat. The one thing a boat could do that no land plane could was reach places without runways. Take that away, and every advantage on the list reverses. The sponsons become weight. The deep, ship-shaped hull becomes a fuselage with a bad shape for going fast, carrying structure built to survive impact with water on an aircraft that will never touch it again. The marine crews, the launches, the buoys, the fuel barges, and the corrosion inspections all become costs the competition doesn't have. The Boeing 314 was not being outperformed by a rival aircraft. It was being outperformed by infrastructure that had already been bought and paid for by somebody else. And the aircraft ready to use that infrastructure had been building the whole time. The Douglas DC-4 came out of the war as the C-54 Skymaster, in numbers, over 1,000 of them, and they had spent years flying exactly the routes in question. Then came the Lockheed Constellation, pressurized, fast, with a cruise well over 300 miles an hour against the Clipper's 180-odd, flying at altitudes where much of the weather is underneath you. Pressurization is the part people underrate. It is not a comfort feature. It is what lets an aircraft climb into thin air where the same engines push it much faster on much less fuel. And it is the single technology the Boeing 314 never had and could not have been given. So the crossing that took a Clipper the better part of a day could be done faster, higher, smoother, and far more cheaply by an aircraft that already existed in the hundreds, whose spares and mechanics were everywhere, and which could put its wheels down without a boat crew coming out to meet it. That is the moment when the competitor stops being an aircraft and becomes a system. A DC-4 landing at Gander in 1946 arrived into a place with hangars, hard standing, fire cover, approach lighting, and men who had serviced the type 1,000 times. A Boeing 314 arriving anywhere needed the Marine base Pan Am had built for it, and Pan Am had to keep every one of those bases staffed and supplied for a fleet of 12 aircraft it no longer needed. Every airline in the world was standardizing on land planes at once, which meant airports improved further, mechanic training pooled, parts got cheaper, insurers got comfortable, financing got easier, and each new land plane made the next one easier to operate. The Clipper was not losing an argument about engineering. It was losing an argument about how many other people had already made the same choice. Pan Am's 1946 decision looks brutal until you see it from Juan Tripp's side. He was not sentimental about aircraft. He had spent 20 years buying whatever opened routes fastest. The flying boat had opened them. Now the runways were free. The aircraft that were sold off give you the last act, and it is not a dignified one. Some went to World Airways, some to American International Airways, a few to smaller operators with ambitions and thin capital. These companies discovered what Pan Am had absorbed quietly for years. A Boeing 314 without a purpose-built ocean support network is an extremely expensive object. 4 big radial engines to overhaul, a hull to keep out of the sea between flights, 11 crew where a DC-4 needed 5. No dining room revenue because nobody was paying liner-beating fares in a market where the fastest way across was now a land plane. On October 11, 1947, Bermuda Sky Queen, formerly Cape Town Clipper, left Foynes for Newfoundland with 62 passengers and 7 crew, well beyond what Pan Am would ever have loaded aboard for that leg. She ran into headwinds far stronger than forecast, and it became clear the fuel would not reach Newfoundland or get back to Ireland. The captain found the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Bibb on Ocean Station and put the flying boat down on the open Atlantic in a heavy swell. Everyone aboard was taken off. It took hours in rough water. Then the Coast Guard sank the hull with gunfire, because a derelict flying boat is a hazard to shipping. That is the second Boeing 314 destroyed by gunfire after successfully saving everyone aboard. The Honolulu Clipper had gone the same way in 1945, adrift after engine failures, with all 46 aboard rescued, and the aircraft refusing to sink until the Navy insisted. In both cases, the aircraft did the hardest thing a flying boat can do: put down on open ocean, stay intact, and keep everybody alive. In engineering terms, these are the design's finest moments. In the public record, they read as 2 more Clippers lost, at exactly the point when the concept needed no help looking obsolete. The rest went for scrap, mostly by 1951. There was talk of preserving one. Nothing came of it. Not one Boeing 314 survives. Now the harder question. Was the flying boat killed, or did it simply stop making sense? Because there is a version of this story in which someone decided the boats had to go. That airport lobbies, or airframe makers with land planes to sell, or governments with wartime concrete to justify, quietly finished off a technology that was still winning on comfort. The evidence for suppression is thin, and the evidence against it is boring and overwhelming. Nobody needed to conspire. Britain reached the same conclusion independently and abandoned its own flying boat services. Every airline on Earth made the same choice at roughly the same time without coordinating, because they were all looking at the same 2 numbers: what a seat cost on a land plane and what it cost on a boat. The Saunders Roe Princess, an enormous British flying boat begun after the war, flew in 1952 into a market that had already gone and was broken up. The concept had not been murdered. Its reason for existing had evaporated, and it happened to evaporate in the same 6 years the Boeing 314 spent proving how good it was. Which brings the whole thing into focus, and the answer is more specific than the war changed everything. Every test the Boeing 314 passed proved a different part of the case, and none of them proved the part that mattered. Puget Sound proved the airframe could be made to fly properly. The Atlantic schedule of 1939 proved oceans could be crossed on a timetable. Lisbon proved passengers would pay enormous money for the experience. Churchill and Roosevelt proved the aircraft was trusted with irreplaceable people. Robert Ford's westward run proved it needed nothing on the ground to survive. The 2 open ocean rescues proved it would hold together in the worst conditions it could meet. That is 6 victories, and they are real. What none of them could establish was that the world would go on lacking runways. The 314's entire commercial logic rested on a temporary condition, an unbuilt planet, and the aircraft's own war effort was conducted alongside the largest construction program in aviation history, which removed that condition permanently. The dining room was never the mistake. The dining room was the correct answer to the question of how you beat an ocean liner. Nobody at Boeing or Pan American got the engineering wrong, or the market wrong, or the customer wrong. They built superbly for a world that stopped existing while they were flying in it. And the ideas survived without the machine. The route network Pan Am had proved out. The navigation practice. The whole notion that a paying passenger could expect a proper meal in the air and arrive rested. All of it transferred straight into land planes, then into the 707, then into the first-class cabins airlines still advertise. The Clipper name went with it. Pan Am kept calling its jets Clippers until the day the airline died in 1991, decades after the last hull was cut up. The one physical place left is a village on the Shannon estuary. Foynes mattered for about a decade, purely because flying boats needed sheltered water, and it had some. And when they stopped coming, it went back to being a small Irish port. The old terminal building is a museum now, and inside it there is a full-size Boeing 314 you can walk through. The flight deck, the berths, the dining salon with the tables laid. It's a replica. It had to be. There was nothing left to put in it.